Spencer, as we think about biblically responsible investing, we need to embrace that it's complex. And when we think about this, we need to think about, are our objections legitimate, or are they smoke screens for some sort of a fear that I just don't want to dive into? So today, we want to talk through some of the frequently asked questions about biblically responsible investing, as well as just share our stories of how we've come to the places that we've come to. Spencer, we share with our listeners a little bit more about just your journey towards biblically responsible investing and what that's looked like over the last couple of years.
Well, and this is something, again, we think that it's important to have a conversation with clients about. There are different paths that I think people can be faithful in moving down. It's looked different for me over the years, and we're all on a journey here. So what we want to say up front is, let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And also, let's not settle for good enough. Here. Let's really be thoughtful and let's act as stewards, which is an uncomfortable position because it's never ours. Mm-hmm. We're constantly going before the Lord and trying to listen to His wisdom on this. But thinking back, I grew up with a father who was in the business and so was interested in investments over time, but it wasn't really as much on my mind of where am I investing, funds. When I joined him in 2010, I certainly started to think more in depth about this and recognize that there's certain firms that are doing things that I don't really, that I don't get behind, that I'm not excited about. Certainly a tobacco firm that they're trying to sell products that are going to create addiction, and particularly in the developing world, that's not exciting, to get behind. At the same time, the landscape is constantly changing in the investment world. And so looking back in 2010, there weren't as many options that were out there in the investment landscape. The ones that I looked at, the expenses were quite a bit higher, and I didn't feel like there was a consistency in terms of the way that they were approaching things that really resonated, with me at the time. Now, I also hadn't grappled as deeply about the biblical wisdom and the biblical admonition that we need to stay away from ill-gotten gain. Mm-hmm. And I really hadn't thought through how that relates to, say, gambling, how that relates, as deeply to tobacco or those areas that take human life, like weapons or abortion or other places there. So some of it was, I just hadn't grappled with it at the same level that I feel like we've worked through over the last couple of years. But some of it, there legitimately weren't as many options, out there to faithfully implement. Fast forward about 5 years, we had a missionary client who came to us and said, I have these funds. I want to make sure that they're invested, but above all, I want to make sure that I'm not investing in companies that are harming very people that I served in Africa. And she had significant time in a lot of different African countries, but the one that she was most concerned about was North Sudan. Because at the time, and this has been on and off for over a decade, but you have companies coming in and paying the regime high values, bribes, and other payments there, and then the government, the regime in power, will take those funds and use it to perpetrate genocide on a subset of its people. So she said, I want nothing to do with any of these companies. Well, I hadn't actually even heard of companies that were funding this genocide. It was not on my radar screen. I had heard of Darfur. I knew of some of the atrocities that were happening there, but I didn't know the funding mechanism. So you come to realize that there were 4 companies at the time that were publicly traded, global companies, PetroChina, Sinopec, ONGC, and Petronas, that were paying the North Sudanese government. And so what we did from that point across our investors' investments, tried as much as we could to set a screen in place where we're not investing in companies that are contributing to genocide. And that's not just in North Sudan. There are other hotspots around the world, but as you might imagine, there's not that many publicly traded companies that are actually engaging in business with North Korea. Yeah. So it's a small subset of companies, but we wanted to say, hey, these companies, if they are engaged in bribing countries that are then perpetrating genocide, that's among the worst of things. We can all get behind, let's not contribute to anything that's going to be supporting genocide there. So that was an initial step. As we engaged in that step, though, and as I looked at my own portfolio and aligned it there as well, I started to reach out to a number of the different denominational or Christian, based investment companies and look at their portfolios. And what was deeply disconcerting to me is seeing that many of them had PetroChina. Many of them had Sinopec. Many of them had these companies that were doing this. And there were even screeners that were out there that were publicly available that would look at a company like PetroChina, and it would purport that it was a biblical screen or biblically responsible investment screen, but it wouldn't list that PetroChina was paying huge sums of money to the Northern Sudanese government. That wouldn't screen them out, so to speak. So I reached out to a number of different companies and made them aware of, this issue. It wasn't, something that I had just discovered. There's a whole Investors Against Genocide movement that's out there, but it had not really come into those denominational circles. So I was pretty skeptical of, anything beyond some of the most basic of screens that are out that were out there. But really over the last couple of years, really digging into the scriptures and saying, okay, help me understand, what does the Bible really say about the ways that we invest, and being open in a more significant way to making a movement there. And I think some of this comes from this idea that if we really view God as our provider, if we really believe that He is the one that is going to sustain us, that it is our work to be faithful, but it's not our work to, say, provide for everything that we need. I think the opening up of my hands and my heart in that space allowed me to say, okay, well, let me see if there's a better way here. There's a more faithful way based on the biblical wisdom, and going through a couple of classes here over the last couple of years have continued to push me to think more about what is ill-gotten gain, and to kind of arrive at this thought process that ill-gotten gain, fundamentally, if a company's product and service, if its whole goal is to increase addictive behaviors, in its customers and its clients, it's really hard to get excited about that company, to say, man, I want them to grow. I want them to pay higher dividends to me. If I'm invested in a company that is, a casino, do I want more people to be ensnared by that casino just so they can pay out a dividend maybe that's a little bit higher, or have a rate of growth that's higher from a stock valuation standpoint? It became, more and more dissonance there as I looked at things. As well, you look at different companies and you say, if I could, I'd like to have companies that, on the balance, they do a better job in their practices of honoring their customers, employees, suppliers. They don't have these adversarial relationships that are as significant. Now, every company is going to compete. Every company is going to have, to walk through and decide, okay, here's where we price things, here's where we say no, all these kinds of different considerations. But there's some companies that really delight customers, that seem to be one step ahead in terms of service, these different things. And then there's some companies that every time you interact with them, it's just adversarial in nature. And so there's part of me also that's starting to say, okay, could I shift my investment to invest much more significantly in these companies that they just seem to, by their values, do things in a way that is right.
Yeah.
So looking at that, and then seeing that the landscape has continued to develop, and there's a lot more options that are out there. Now, I will say that there's still no option that I've found that perfectly replicates what I would like invested, because even those companies that I can get behind, by and large, there is one screen with one of the investment companies that I have my personal funds in, that they're not going to invest in nuclear power. And I think nuclear power is a good thing on the balance overall, both because those power plants can be put in certain areas, the small modular reactors, and because of the carbon footprint of those, and because they can be manufactured, ideally in kind of in a mass way in the States. There's just all kinds of good things. Yeah. I think that I would like to see that option continue to be explored, but it's a screen.
Yeah.
And so I'm not going to see that. Now, all of these other companies that are being screened out and these practices that are being embraced through active management, I can get behind all of those things, but it's not perfect.
Yeah.
And I think that's where, we have to come back to that idea that let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Yeah.
We're all on a journey here. We're trying to move towards a posture of faithfulness. We're trying to listen, to receive, and to hear what the Lord says. And that doesn't take away from the fact that, okay, He's also dealing with us. How much should we actually keep? Mm-hmm. Because I could make the argument that, if we just build a bigger barn, but we build it with companies that maybe are doing some good, that it can still harm our soul. Mm-hmm. So there's lots of different things. This isn't the only thing that we're thinking about as we consider investment, as we consider a financial plan, but it's one of the pieces.
Right.
So how about for yourself? Where do you find yourself in terms of this journey?
Yeah, so in terms of my journey, I started with a nonprofit in about 2010, right after college. And they had a 403B, and we were required to put money into it, thankfully. And so I just put money in. And I think at that time, I don't remember selecting the fund. There was so much going on at our staff training. My wife and I were engaged at the time, so we were also planning our wedding. The staff training was a long period for this organization. And so it was a blip on the radar. So I decided whatever, I guess, my risk tolerance was high, or I just said, give me a target date fund. Didn't think about it. I legitimately did not think about it again until I started working here. Mm. And a lot of that I think was good because I didn't have a whole lot of extra mental capacity. There were so many other things in my life that were going on. We had to raise our own support and raise our own salary. And so oftentimes when I was thinking about my finances, it was, okay, is God going to provide a paycheck this month? Not, where is my retirement investment going? And so for most of my investing career, it was, I think there's money going to my retirement, but that's about all I thought about. Mm-hmm. But then when I started with the firm, these ideas of, okay, what is the market? What is investing? That's where it really kind of started and sparked. And so first couple of years with the firm, it was just understanding what actually investing is. I came from a totally separate background in data analytics. And so it was learning about what does it mean to be an advisor. And so, but really what started the change for me was when we went through our 923 fellowship and really starting to ask some of those broader questions of what does it truly mean to be a steward of God's resources? Really asking the questions that we bring up oftentimes in this podcast of, God is my provider. Do I trust Him? Mm-hmm. How much is enough? Mm-hmm. And then how much do I keep? Mm-hmm. And when we started asking those questions, it really changed that entirety of the framework of my investing philosophy to say, okay, with these decisions, as God is a steward, He does care about where all of my decisions about stewardship are. My decisions about how am I stewarding my family, my decisions about how am I stewarding my time. When we looked at the Wesley interview or the Wesley episode, how am I stewarding my memory? What am I filling my mind with? Mm. Is it things that are honoring to the Lord or just things that ping pong in and out and really have no merit long term? And so as I started thinking about this, it was really, again, coming back to that idea of what is ill-gotten gain? And when we look at the scriptures and see how strongly Jesus talks about it, or how strongly scriptures talk about it, and how the Pharisees wouldn't take ill-gotten gain back into the temple because they knew how God felt about it, it really started sparking me to say, well, what is in my portfolio? And started asking those questions like you did. And I'm just really thankful that we've had this time and space together to work through this, because honestly, I wouldn't have thought about it probably until the day that I died. Again, as I've thought about this, it was always future Austin's money. Mm-hmm. All of our investments right now they're in qualified accounts that are set aside for retirement. And so it was not things that I actively thought about. Mm-hmm. And so really it was a movement in faithfulness towards the Lord of saying, not only is future money yours, but current money is yours. All of it is yours. And how do I be a faithful steward of these things? And legitimately for a while there, I also held this idea of biblical responsible investing at arm's length, because I thought, well, I'm not really earning too much from casinos or tobacco. And so if I'm only holding a really small portion of that, how bad is it really? Mm-hmm. But again, coming back to that idea of, no, God owns it all. He cares about it all. Mm-hmm. And I can't let perfect be the enemy of the good, but I also can't let those smoke screens, well, God doesn't really worry about that. It's going to be more about how I use it. No, he does care about the gains. Mm-hmm. I am a steward of all of the resources that God has given me, not just future Austin's resources. Like it is current, past, future, present. And yet I come back to Lamentations 3. For this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercy never comes to an end. They are new every morning. Great is his faithfulness. And so as I think about that, as I wrestle with that, I have to remind myself that my posture towards biblically responsible investing and just kind of washing over and saying, well, I can't control it. I can't control what these companies do. So I'm just going to invest in the market broadly and let God take care of what I do in the future as I actually utilize these resources. That's what matters. But now as I'm wrestling with this, I am reminded I'm on a trajectory with the Lord. I'm on a path with the Lord, that his mercies are new every morning, that I don't have to look back in shame of maybe what I didn't do in the past, but I can look forward and say, no, God is walking us into a beautiful new place, both for me and my family, but as well as just how I see stewardship. And again, coming back to how much do I keep? If it's all the Lord's, how do I participate with him in every moment? So Spencer, as we look at some of these frequently asked questions, we kind of touched on them a little bit in both our stories, but you want to launch us in, doesn't God just care about how I use his resources and not how I grew his resources?
Well, and that's where I think the first episode that we just talked through, ill-gotten gain, how it is defined in both Proverbs and then Deuteronomy 23. And then we look at the story with Judas, bringing the money back to the chief priests. In each one of those, we see God actually does care. And whether it's set up in his law, or even as we see the way that Jesus would approach things, he said he did not want a person to come and give their money to the temple if they had the obligation of taking care of their parents. He didn't want to declare those funds off limits just because they were going to give them to the temple and they would then therefore not have to take care of their parents. He's looking at how we serve as stewards across the entirety of our lives. So I think that it's not the best path to say, okay, we're just going to look at using the resources rather than how we actually grew the resources in the path. And one of the ways that we could, do this would be a kind of a ridiculous example. But if we knew that we had a friend who was being harmed, like a good friend who was being harmed by a company that we were invested in and that we were actually profiting from that company.
Yeah.
Well, we would know that's not true. That's not good.
Yeah.
Now, we may not know some of the people that are being harmed by, 7-year-olds receiving, cigarettes being passed out, or the people that are lured into casinos and the money taken from them, again, by their own choices, but still preying on their frailties. If that was John down the road that we had a good relationship with, we would know that's bad.
Yeah.
But just because there's this layering in financial transactions in the market and companies and such, and we've got this interconnected global economy, I don't think that makes us any less culpable necessarily.
Yeah. Well, so what about this idea of, you kind of touched on it when you were sharing your story, but is it even possible to invest faithfully? And will it really make a difference?
Well, and I think this is where we separate those two questions. It's possible to invest, I think, more faithfully. It's possible to be more of a steward. It's not possible to be a perfect steward.
Yeah.
So there is gray in every company. There's no perfect company. There's no, even the companies that maybe they do something that we know as a good or product or service there. Maybe their whole mission is to cure childhood cancer in one arena. Well, we can all get behind and say, well, that's great. We're so excited about that. But they're still made up of these companies are made up of people.
Yeah.
And people are all fallen.
Yeah.
So we have to recognize it's never going to be possible to perfectly deploy capital in a way that every decision that's made is going to align with what God would have.
Right.
It's possible, though, to invest in a way that is more faithful than other ways. And that's where we see, okay, if I could just avoid some ill-gotten gain, if I could just take investments out of my portfolio that would be related to owning casinos, owning tobacco companies, owning companies that are pushing forward just a dehumanization of women through, pornography. If I can get away from those things, that's a step in the right direction, it feels like.
Yeah.
Is it solving everything? If I have an investment in a company that's a fast food company and they don't do everything perfectly, okay, yeah, maybe they're causing people to eat more hamburgers than would be useful for their diet. But that's a far cry from a lot of kind of the horrors of that we would talk about with respect to seeing someone absolutely addicted to gambling, to pornography, to tobacco.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll touch on this next one here of how do I even find out the companies that I have in a mutual fund or an ETF? So I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole, and I will say it's challenging. It's actually really hard, especially if you've got some of these target date funds. So in my 403B, my funds were invested in a Vanguard target date fund, the 2050 fund. Thankfully, Vanguard's 2050 fund is comprised of 4 of Vanguard's funds: the total stock market, the total international stock market, the total bond market, and the total international bond market. But to find out all of that, I had to look at my last statement from my 403B provider from my former employer, look at the selection that I had, then go to Vanguard's website and figure out what's in that fund or the correlated fund. And then to find out the companies, you then have to go to the prospectus for that fund and look through Vanguard's total stock market and total international stock market, invest in every single publicly traded company possible. And so there are thousands upon thousands of listings. And so I would have had to go line by line through every single one of them. It's tough. Now, when I shifted over to working with our firm, my first investment here was with a Fidelity target date fund. And when I looked at that one after preparing this episode, that fund had 13 US mutual funds underneath it, 9 international mutual funds, 12 bond funds, and 6 short-term assets. So if I wanted to find out the actual companies that I held, I would not only have had to look and see, oh, I'm in a Fidelity target date fund. Well, I'd have to go one layer deeper. Okay, what is this first US fund? What is the second? What is the third? And go into the prospectuses, go into the holdings. It takes diligence and effort. Now, thankfully, there are some screening websites that you can look at that will help you understand a little bit better. But the reality is the due diligence takes time. It takes time to actually look at your statement and see, okay, what are the option sets that I have within a 401k, a 403b? Thankfully, IRA providers, typically you have a little bit more latitude with what's out there, but oftentimes you may not have access to the entirety of the investment landscape. And so this is where we say, finding out the companies that you own, it's not impossible, but it is going to take some time and effort.
Well, and there are options there to be able to align funds with providers that they say we're either going to screen out some level of firms, some specific firms, or we're going to be actively target investing in firms that align with a lot of different ideals. So there are ways that we can simplify this, and they don't have to be tremendously time intensive. But if we're at a place where we don't know what we own right now, they're in a fund of funds like you talked about, then it's a deep, deep, deep hole to go down to figure out what's going on.
Yeah. Okay, Spencer, let's walk back to, will the investments that I make actually make a difference? Can you walk us through that?
Well, a lot of it is we are owners, we're stewards. And so regardless of what rate of return we get, the Lord first expects faithfulness. We'll talk about this in a future episode, really looking at Matthew 25 and the owner and steward, relationship there. But first, he expects faithfulness from us. So the first response to that, I think, would be to say, well, I'm not sure that my owning one company versus another is going to have a big impact on the company that I don't own. I actually don't think that it'll have a huge difference. Now, if we had several million people that were convicted of wanting to go in this direction, they change their path, then it would start to have an impact there. One person, probably not.
Yeah.
Many people, it can start to have that snowballing effect that our voices can be heard, that we just really don't want to invest in those companies where there's ill-gotten gain. So I think that practically it is something that people can raise. But if we look at the biblical evidence again, what the Bible would suggest is just don't do this. I don't want you to do this.
Yeah.
And so if we believe that to be true, then our response, whether a company will sell to 7-year-olds in Indonesia cigarettes or not, if we stay away from that practice, then we're avoiding still that ill-gotten gain.
Yeah. Well, and I think to your point, one thing we'll come back to again and again and again. Mm-hmm. Do we trust the Lord to be our provider?
Right.
Or are we trusting in these investment firms for our future security? Mm-hmm. And I think that really needs to be a core piece of the question. Mm-hmm. Is my faith in the Lord that He will provide my daily bread, both today and in the future? Or do I feel like I so need to perfectly invest in the market, invest in ways that are going to guarantee me future returns so that my future is stable, mm-hmm. so that my whatever desires that I have for future life are stable? Mm-hmm. Is my trust in those companies, or is my trust in the Lord?
Well, and I think if we even hone in on that question a little bit more, one of the things that sometimes we're asked is, okay, if this approach, if it performs worse than, say, a general market approach does, are we mismanaging God's resources? And I think we come back to, the idea that if God is our provider, if He is the one that created the universe and He owns it all, then He doesn't need us to get a little bit higher rate of return. What He actually needs us to do is be faithful.
Yeah.
So what He's calling us to do is to be faithful. Now, again, what we would hope to be able to do is to have a rate of return that is not terribly dissimilar from what we would see in the investment markets, because at the end of the day, we still are investing in companies that are publicly traded. We're just doing so in a way that we're trying to avoid ill-gotten gain and kind of encourage those practices that seem to be a bit more redemptive.
Yeah.
And one of the other kind of underlying questions that we would get from clients that might not even ever be stated would be, if I invest in a way that provides a lesser return, could it keep me from actually having enough? And I think this is, again, one of those thorny things where we say, if I put on my investment advisor, financial planner hat and say, okay, well, we don't know, but the rate of return, it could theoretically be less on these investments that you make, because we're screening out some of these investments, could be less. Then, if we trace that through your financial plan, then yes, you could have less at the end of your life. And if you were already pretty close to not having enough, then theoretically we could say, yes, maybe there's not the resources there. All of that is hypothetical, in nature. But again, it comes back to us trying to optimize things for the highest rate of return. That being like the entire goal, the only goal, so to speak. When we look at, what the biblical wisdom would be, it'd be, God expects a rate of return. There's an expected level of profitability, but that's not the only consideration that we're looking at there.
Yeah. Well, and as I think about the entirety of human history, mm-hmm. this idea to invest in thousands of companies is a relatively new phenomenon.
Right.
And throughout human history, God has always provided for His people. Mm-hmm. He always looks out for His people. And oftentimes it doesn't look like the ways that I perceive or think that it should work out. Mm-hmm. But I have to return, is my faith in Jesus? Mm-hmm. Or is my faith in my ability to generate a rate of return? Mm-hmm. It needs to be in Jesus. Mm-hmm. And I have to continue to come back to that question. Well, is having enough really the end goal? Mm-hmm. Or is faithfulness in Jesus? Mm-hmm. And really, in a lot of ways and in a lot of times, I look back at myself and I think, what am I providing for? Mm-hmm. Is it providing security so that I don't need to trust in the Lord? Mm-hmm. How much are my investments really shielding me from actually putting my faith in Jesus?
Right.
And I think those are the harder questions to really come back to. These frequently asked ones, they are important to come to, but I think the heart level things of, where is my trust? Am I really asking that question of, how much is enough for me? How much is enough for the next generation? How much am I keeping for myself that is maybe above what I need to keep? Mm-hmm. Those are really the heart level pieces that we want to drive home towards, that say, yes, these are good questions to ask, but where's my heart? Mm-hmm. Am I soft towards the Lord in trusting his provision? Or am I just trying to keep it at arm's bay so that I know that I will be secure?
Right. And part of it is, once we even start to have that conversation, we can start to say, okay, well, I've been over here. Let's just be honest. I've been over here kind of with the world story of investment of, I want to be really well diversified and I want to try to maximize gain, relative to risk and those kinds of different things. What might the Lord be inviting me to in terms of maybe changing the approach or altering the approach that I've been taking? And this is something, as we talk with clients, we're never going to beat a client over the head and say, you've got to go this, particular approach. Yeah. We do our best to lay out the different frameworks. If there is a client that clearly does not line up with this in terms of core values, then again, we're not going to push them off the ledge and say, hey, you still got to go this direction. Because we do recognize that if we screen certain firms, that the rate of return is going to differ from the market's return. Now, that could be better, that could be worse. It could be close to the same, but because you're not investing in all the same funds or all the same companies, then one would logically expect those rates of return to be different. So we just have to, we have to be willing to embrace that as part of the approach that we're going to take if we choose to implement it.
Yeah. Well, thanks for walking us through that last little piece there, Spencer. The reality is, investing in a biblically responsible way can be really complex and it can be really challenging. Clients, we would love to have a conversation with you. If you've got questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below, and we look forward to seeing you again next time.
We want to thank our friends at the Eventide Center for Faith and Investing. Jason Meyer and his team did a fantastic job helping us to grapple with the biblical wisdom on investing. Many of the quotes and thought leaders that we cite come from their original research.
If you found this episode valuable, share it with a friend and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform so that you don't miss the next episode.
This content was provided by Second Half Stewardship. We are in Knoxville, Tennessee, and you can visit our website at www.secondhalfstewardship.com. The information in this recording is intended for general educational and informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advisory, financial planning, legal, tax, or other professional advice based on your specific situation. Please consult your professional advisor before taking any action based on its contents.